Hello and welcome to my August reading wrap-up. I usually do wrap-ups, or I've been trying to do wrap-ups every 5 books read, but I've discovered that it's actually really difficult to plan my videos if I do it that way because I don't necessarily know at what points in the month I will have read the next 5 books. So that doesn't seem to be working, which is why there has been no mid-month or whatever wrap up this month, and I have read 21 books. So this is going to be a really long video and I will try to keep it as speedy as possible, but it's just going to be a long video because I have a lot of books to talk about. So I apologise for that, and what I'm going to be doing from now on is I will do a mid-month wrap up around halfway through the month, and then I will do a wrap up at the end of the month for the books that I read over the next couple of weeks, and hopefully that will work a little bit better. So we'll see how that goes, but for now I'm going to run through all of the books I read and wrap up most of them for you. So the first book that I read this month was Rebirth, the first book in the Divinity's Twilight series by Christopher Russell, and I actually have a full review of this one up on my channel, which I will link here for you, and so I'm not going to spend any time on this one now other than to say it is epic war-based fantasy and I really enjoyed it. The next 5 books that I read were for my reading challenge for the month of August, where I read books that had been picked for me from my TBR by Lee. So again, I have a full video discussing all of those books individually, which I will link here, and if you want any more information on any of these then you can go and watch that, but for now I'll just quickly run through those books. So the first is the Travelling Cat Chronicles by Hiro Arikawa, which is a contemporary with some magical elements because part of the story is told from the perspective of a cat, and I really enjoyed it. Then I read Alice in Wonderland by Simon James Green, which is a contemporary YA rom-com type story, and I thought it was absolutely hilarious and brilliant. Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which is hard science fiction, and I surprisingly really enjoyed it. Surprising because it has sentient giant spiders in it. Then I read Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. This is a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin and it is young adult fantasy. Thoroughly enjoyed myself. And finally, one that isn't actually out yet, is The Gilded Ones by Namina Fauna, which is also young adult fantasy, and I thoroughly enjoyed this one. Then I read another book that isn't out yet. I read this one on NetGalley, and that was the Tea Dragon Tapestry by Katie O'Neill, which is the next book in the Tea Dragon series, I suppose, which is a series of graphic novels which are authored and illustrated by Katie O'Neill, and they are absolutely beautiful. The artwork is stunning, the storylines are incredibly cute. This one was just as cute as the last 2. It's about discovering yourself and following your morals, and there were characters from the first and the second books in this 3rd installment, and I can't wait for it to come out so that I can add it to my collection because really I read them for the art. The art is just so pretty. Next up, a book I actually forgot to include in my book haul. This is Nick and Charlie by Alice Oseman. This is a novella about Nick and Charlie from the Heartstopper comics, but this one is told in prose. There are some illustrations throughout this edition. The story itself has been out for a while, but it is only just now available in print, and as you might know, I prefer to read in print. It, as usual, tore out my heart and stomped all over it. I absolutely loved it, and if you haven't read any of the graphic novels, I wouldn't necessarily recommend starting with this because this is where Nick and Charlie have already established their relationship and we're very used to them by the time we get to this story. So I would say read Heartstopper first, and you can do that online for free, but once you've done so, I highly recommend this. It's It's beautiful. Then I read the Thoughtful Book Club's pick for the month of August, which was Summer Bird Blue by Akemi Dawn Bowman, which is a contemporary story that follows Rumi, who in the first chapter of the story is in a car accident with her mother and her sister, and her younger sister unfortunately passes away in that accident, and they were incredibly close. They made music together, and Rumi is having a really hard time with her grief. She is very angry with herself and her sister and the world and her mum as well, because her mum has sent her to live with her aunt in Hawaii, and she doesn't want to be with anyone, she doesn't want to talk to anyone, she wants to just wallow in her misery. And the way that Akemi deals with grief in this story was really well handled. Some of the members of book club didn't enjoy how repetitive some of this story was, and it is because Rumi is stuck in this cycle of anger, and so she keeps experiencing the same things, and I think that that is very reminiscent of grief, but I can totally see why that would be aggravating for some readers, so bear that in mind. Of course, massive trigger warnings for grief for this one, and if you want any more details about trigger warnings for this book, Akemi has a whole section on her website for content warnings for her books, so if you're interested in reading this one, go and check that out as well, and she has a full list available for you. Overall, I really enjoyed this one. I really like Akemi's writing. I find it very impactful but easy to read, and I really enjoyed that. Then I read Song Below Water by Bethany C. Morrow, which is young adult fantasy but urban fantasy. So in this story, our world is our world, but other beings exist. So mermaids exist, sirens exist, etc, etc, and a lot of the mythology, I suppose, that this is based on is African, which is really interesting. I had to look up a few things and learn a little bit about African mythology, which I really enjoyed doing because I didn't know anything about African mythology before reading this. I still don't know very much, it's a very short book, but I enjoyed the way this book challenged me to learn something new about a mythology that I wasn't aware of before. Unfortunately though, I really struggled to follow the beginning of this story, and not because I wasn't familiar with the mythology, but because it's so short. It jumps in time quite a lot, and it jumps in the minds of the characters a lot, so not everything is fully explained. So I really do wish that this had been a little bit longer, because I think that the overall plot was really good, but I'm a character-driven reader, and so I just wanted a little bit more explanation about what was going on in the minds of the characters, and a little bit more time spent on building the relationships between the characters, because the relationships were really strong, but I kind of wanted to see that on the page more. So I still enjoyed this one, but I do just wish it had been a little bit longer and allowed itself to spend more time on building this really rich world and telling me all about it, and telling me everything that the characters are thinking and feeling and going through, and how they're going through those things together, because overall the plot was great, but I need more. That's just me as a character-driven reader. I need more than just an interesting plot. Then I read You Should See Me in a Crown by Leah Johnson, and this is a YA contemporary about Liz, and Liz has an aspiration to go to a really prestigious university, but she's entirely reliant on financial aid to be able to do that, and unfortunately right at the beginning of the story her application for financial aid is rejected, and so she's really worried that she's not going to be able to go to university, and if she does go to university that it will have a huge financial impact on her family. So she comes up with a plan to run for prom queen, because at her school prom queen and prom king are a really big deal, and the winners win a massive cash prize which would solve all her financial difficulties. So Even though she's more of an introvert and doesn't really like to put herself out there, she decides to go for it. And this is really funny and fun. And Liz is a really great character. There's some really interesting relationships between the various characters, and how relationships that can seem perfect on the surface actually need a little bit of work and need to be improved upon. And there was something about the writing in this story that just felt very vivid to me. I'm not a visual reader, but I could just feel myself in the shoes of maybe a side character watching all of this play out, and that was really, really enjoyable. It was a very easy read as well, which was very, very nice. I liked the simplistic writing style that Leah Johnson used in this one, and it was just a fun and easy read, and I really enjoyed it for that. Next, I read Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, which is an adult dark academia is what people tend to categorise this as. For me personally, I found this more paranormal mystery. So we are set at Yale University, and our characters are part of one of the societies at Yale University, and their responsibility is to manage the supernatural activities of other Yale secret societies. So that's where the dark academia stuff comes from, but essentially this is a ghost story with a murder mystery at its centre. And I think if I had known that, I probably would have picked this up much, much sooner, because I love ghost stories. Maybe that sounds surprising to you given I'm such a wimp and I avoid horror, but I don't know, there's just something about paranormal fantasy involving ghosts and mysteries that I have always really enjoyed. Maybe it's because of my love of the Mediator series that I read when I was younger. I don't know, but I really, really enjoyed this. There are a couple of perspectives in here, and there's a little bit of time jumping, which did make the beginning of this one a little bit difficult for me. What I've discovered this month, I think, is that there are two kinds of beginnings to any story, but particularly a fantasy or a science fiction story where you're setting up an entirely new kind of world with new rules. Even if it's urban and still our world, there are new rules. And those books can either start with an info dump, so giving you all of the information, all of how everything looks and works and feels, but none of the context of why any of that is important. Or it can start like this book did, by giving you lots of stuff that's going on, but none of the information about how that stuff is working and why that stuff is important, and so on and so forth. And most people prefer this way of doing it. I am one of the strange people that prefers the info dump at the beginning of the story, so that once we get into the action, I understand what's going on. That doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy this, it just meant that the learning curve was a little bit more steep for me at the beginning of the story than it would have been if it had gone about it the other way of doing things. So it just took me a little bit of time to settle myself in the world and what was going on and what the importance of all that was. But once I was in it, I was invested and I really enjoyed myself. I didn't guess where the plot was going at any point. I tend to try not to guess, and I didn't, and I'm really, really interested to see what is going to happen in the next instalment, which I don't think is going to be out until next year maybe, but either way there are a lot of open threads at the end of this one, and I suppose that's something to be aware of as well. It's closed enough that it doesn't feel like a cliffhanger, but it's definitely not the end. Then I read Secret History by Brandon Sanderson. I'm holding up Arcanum Unbounded. This is a bind-up of various short stories within the Cosmere, and I read Secret History, which is one of the novellas in here, and I have kind of mixed feelings about it. I enjoyed being back in the world of Mistborn First Era. I'm not going to tell you what this is about, by the way, because it's massive spoilers for First Era Mistborn and some of Second Era Mistborn, so I'm not going to tell you anything about the plot. If you are a Sanderson fan, you probably already know, and if you're not, then you don't want to. But this explores a little bit more of the lore, which I really enjoyed, but a little bit towards the end I felt like it was one cherry too many on top of the cake, if you know what I mean. And that's all I'm going to say because it's really, really spoilery to talk about this one. Then I read W. Juliet by Emura, which is a manga, and it follows two characters in school. One of them is an androgynous looking female who always gets cast in the male lead roles in drama club, and the other is a male student who is cross-dressing as a woman as part of a bet with their father. So their father wants them to take over the family business. I don't know why I'm calling them because it's he, so sorry about that. So he and his father have got into an argument because he wants to be an actor and his dad wants him to take over the family business. And so they've entered into a deal that if he can get through high school and persuade everybody that he is a girl, then his dad will let him be an actor and not take over the family business. And this is quite old, I think. Yeah, so it was originally published in 1997, so reasonably old, but I didn't appreciate this. I didn't like what it did with gender. It just felt problematic to me. It was like this person was, so there was the one character who was female and looked androgynous and so got cast in a male role all the time and really didn't like that. So that felt uncomfortable to me. And then there was this other character who is male, who's dressing as a female but doesn't identify as female, is just doing it to win a bet with his dad, and that also felt incredibly uncomfortable to me and didn't feel respectful to transgender people or people within the transgender spectrum, and I just didn't enjoy it. It also jumped around a lot in the story and was a little bit difficult to follow anyway, so I wasn't a fan of this, unfortunately, and I won't be continuing on with the series. Next up, I read Noughts Crosses by Mallory Blackman, and this is sort of a contemporary but dystopian style story where there are noughts that are white people and crosses that are black people, and the crosses are the leaders of society and the noughts are the oppressed part of society, which was an interesting flip of what the world actually looks like, and I thought that was really interestingly done. Mallory Blackman, if you don't know, is a black author, a British black author, and we follow a character who is a nought and a character who is a cross, and they are best friends, but society doesn't really want them to be best friends, and so there were a few Romeo and Juliet style vibes in this story because ultimately the relationship between these two characters and their differences is central to the storyline. This is quite a dark story, especially Callum, who is the male white character. His storyline in particular is very, very dark, and it was more dark than I was expecting, but it was quite powerful. I do recommend this story. I would just say look up the trigger warnings before you go into it and be prepared for it to be very, very sad. It is a pretty classic dystopian in that way. I found that in recent years dystopians tend to be a little bit more hopeful, whereas this is more in the older style of dystopian that was around when I was a teenager, like The Hunger Games and Divergent, etc., where there's less hope involved. So really enjoyed it, but also pretty devastating. Next, a completely different tone. We have The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune, and I absolutely adored this book. I'm going to be filming a full book review for it, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this now because that book review will be coming your way next week. But suffice it to say, the description I've heard of this book, that it is middle grade for adults, is spot on. That's exactly what it is. It is just perfect. I absolutely loved it. It's my favourite book I've read so far this year. I can't wait to read it again, and I can't recommend it enough. It's fantastic. Next up, I read Temeraire by Naomi Novik, which is the first book in the Temeraire series, which is kind of historical fantasy, so it's kind of an alternate history of the Napoleonic War, but with dragons. So there's an air force, and the air force is made up of dragons and their riders, and I really enjoyed that. The character Temeraire, which is the dragon, is just fantastic. I absolutely loved Temeraire as a character, and I loved his relationship with Lawrence, who is his rider. And I really enjoyed the parts of the story that were about Lawrence and Temeraire's relationship with each other and with other dragons and other dragon riders. That was all fantastic. What I didn't particularly enjoy so much was the plot line, which is incredibly combat and tactics focused, which really isn't my thing. And if that's the only thing that's driving the plot forwards, I get a bit bored pretty quickly. So Rebirth, that I mentioned earlier, is war-based fantasy, but it's not the only plot line. Because it's epic fantasy, there's lots of interweaving plot lines, and that made it much more enjoyable for me. But with this one, the combat and the tactics and the planning and all that kind of thing were the only plot, and that just isn't for me. I have spoken to a friend of mine who has read some of these books, and some of them are as combat heavy as this one is, and some of them are not, and I think that the second one is not meant to be as combat heavy, so I might go ahead and read that one, but we shall see. I didn't enjoy that element of the story, but I did really enjoy Temeraire and Lawrence and all the relationships, like I said. The next book that I read was Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, or Alice's Adventures in Wonderland more specifically, which, funnily enough, I had never read before, and it's a very quick and easy read, and it is just as much nonsense as I was expecting. I hope that I don't need to explain what the plot of this story is, but we follow Alice, who follows a rabbit that is wearing a waistcoat and a pocket watch and declaring that he is running late down a rabbit hole, and she descends into Wonderland, which is a place where nonsense is rife and nothing is normal, nothing is sensical. I think if you're a visual reader, this story works perfectly. If you're not a visual reader, it may be a bit difficult, and I would recommend watching the film first and then reading the book, which is not something I do very often, but I feel like the fact that I could visualise specifically scenes from the Disney adaptation of Alice, that just made it a much more enjoyable reading experience for me. We are getting towards the end now. The next one I read was Permission by Saskia Vogel, which is an adult contemporary romance story. I picked this one up because it was recommended to me as having polyrep in it, and it does, but actually this story is a lot more about grief than it is about romance and relationships, which I wasn't expecting. And although the writing of this was good and interesting. I was a little bit let down by the storyline and the relationship. So this follows Echo, who loses her dad near the beginning of the story, and she is dealing with that, and she's also dealing with the fact that she is not one for monogamous relationships. And then she meets Orly, who is her across the road neighbour and who is a dominatrix, and this just felt very removed. I didn't feel like I was with the characters. I was just reading something that happened to some people. I wasn't there with them. I didn't feel connected to them. It was like a film that was on in the background that I was kind of watching, but I was busy doing something else. And that was a shame, because I think that I could have really enjoyed this one if it had just been a little bit more intimate, I think is what I was looking for here, and I just didn't get that. And then the last 2 books that I read in the month of August are part of my next reading challenge, so I'm not going to talk about them here at all. I've already shown what they are on Instagram, so I'll show them here as well and give you a brief overview of what they're about, but I'm not going to talk about them at length. So the first was The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon, which is a middle grade contemporary story about a boy with autism spectrum disorder and Asperger's tendencies. And the other was The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, which is adult fantasy, and I'm not going to say anything else about them in this video, so you're going to have to wait for my reading challenge vlog, which will hopefully go up at the middle of next week. And that is it. That was a mammoth video. If you're still here at the end and you watched the whole video, then leave me a little house emoji for The House in the Cerulean Sea, which was my favourite book this month and so far this year. And I hope that you found this helpful. If you have any thoughts about how I go about doing these wrap-ups moving forwards, if you think my idea to do them twice a month is a good one, or if you would like me to do it differently, let me know that in the comments as well. But that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and want to see more like this from me, then do think about hitting that subscribe button, and I hope to see you here again soon. Thanks! Bye!